afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the BUE Research Centre for Irish Studies Research Seminars for 2021. BUE Research Centre for Irish Studies is a research centre. It is campus-based at the British University in Egypt. We would like to welcome this afternoon Professor Ondrej Pilny and Professor Hiroko Mikami. Professor Ondrej is the director for the Centre for Irish Studies, Charles University, Prague, Czech Republic. He will be giving the research seminar this afternoon. The research seminar is 90 minutes. Professor Hiroko Mikami has kindly agreed to moderate the research seminar for this afternoon. Professor Hiroko Mikami is Professor of Irish Studies at Waseda University in Tokyo, Japan. She also serves as director of the Institute for Irish Studies. She authored Frank McGuinness and his Theatre of Paradox in 2002, and she co-edited and authored Ireland on Stage, Beckett and After in 2007, and Irish Theatre and its Soundscapes 2015. And she has also translated many contemporary Irish plays into Japanese, including Brian Friel's The Freedom of the City and Making History, Tom Murphy's Blanc-Ganer, and The Thief of Christmas, and Frank McGuinness's Innocence, Immutability. Professor Hiroko, I will leave the floor to you now, and Professor Ondrej.
Thank you, Rania. First, I'd like to express our gratitude to the Research Centre for Irish Studies at the British University in Egypt that invited us, fellow members and friends of the Institute for the Irish Studies at Waseda University, Tokyo, to join today's research seminar. We really appreciate that the center and Professor Pilny have agreed to make the starting time of the seminar earlier for us because Tokyo is 7 hours ahead of Cairo. And our deepest thanks and indebtedness go to Dr. Rania M Rafik Khali, the organizer of the seminar, who literally found us in Japan and sent an email message asking if there is a possibility for research collaboration between us. Today, she assigned me an honored role to introduce Professor Ondrej Pilny, who will be lecturing from Prague, the Czech Republic. He is professor of English and American literature and director of the Center for Irish Studies at Charles University. Professor Pilny was one of the organizers of the very successful Conference for International Association for the Study of Irish Literatures, IASIL, back in 2005, hosted by Charles University. And many IASIL Japan members attended that beautiful and historic campus in the center of the city. He made a visit to Japan as chairperson of IASIL to attend annual conference of IASIL Japan in 2018 and gave us a very stimulating keynote lecture in Tokyo. I was privileged to chair his lecture then too. Professor Pilny has published extensively on subjects ranging from Irish literature and theatre to cultural relations between Ireland and Europe, Anglophone drama and theatre, cultural memory, and structuralist theory. Sorry, I haven't shared the... And his recent books are The Grotesque in Contemporary Anglophone Drama, published by Palgrave 2016, and Cultural Convergence, The Dublin Gate Theatre 1928 to 1960, which has just come out again by Palgrave. And as you can see, this is open access, which means you can see, it's very, very generous of him, of them to open, the material to the public. And he translated works by Irish writers into Czech, including James Singh, Flann O'Brien, Samuel Beckett, Brian Friel, Martin McDonough, and Walsh, and Mark O'Rourke. The title of today's seminar is From Celtic Fantasies to Irish Studies, Research in Irish Culture, Past and Present. The seminar will chart the history of the discipline, now referred to as Irish Studies, from the beginnings of the study of Celtic literatures and philology to the present day. Its second part will be dedicated to a survey of Irish Studies associations and centers and some of the current areas of research, with the intention to provide a basic map for graduate students and researchers who may be relative newcomers to the field. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me welcoming Professor Ondrej Pilny.
Thank you so much, Hiroko. And I'm really honored to be the first speaker in this new series. I'm honored to have been invited by BUE and specifically by Rania Khali. And we very much welcome as an international community the new center into our fold, so to speak. I'm also extremely grateful and again honored that I was introduced by Hiroko, whose work I really cherish, and also given the fact that it is indeed past midnight in Tokyo. So, and thank you, many thanks to all the Japanese participants in this session, because this really takes stamina and endurance. So, as you heard, what I intend to do is really just a sort of opening session for a series of future talks, in which my intention is really to provide the basic sort of ground map of interest in Ireland, in Irish culture specifically, because that happens to be my area. I work mostly in literature and in theatre, as you heard. And to give you a summary of the basic networks and associations as a sort of roadmap for people who are sort of perhaps just beginning, who are looking for contacts, etc. And so if you're expecting any kind of revelations in terms of research, I'm afraid that you won't get many of these in this particular session. I'll just share my presentation here. Hopefully you can see my screen now. And the sound is okay. Yeah, perfect, super. So I'll talk for roughly 60 minutes or thereabouts, and then I'll just open up for questions, because that really, I suppose, is the most important thing about this talk, that we can share our thoughts. Afterwards, you can ask whatever I might be able to help with. Now, this talk really starts in the late 18th century, at the point where, of course, after the English colonization of Ireland, or plantation, I should say, has been completed in the 17th century, the native social order, and to a large extent also the culture, sort of gradually went into decline, and the sort of social structures were replaced by new ones. There was a new social elite that established itself, the so-called ascendancy, and it is only in the late 18th century where the descendants of these settlers really start being interested in Irish past and in Irish culture, beginning to identify themselves with Ireland rather than with where their families would have come from initially. Much of what I'll be saying about the 18th and the 19th century is based on the wonderful work of Joep Leursen, who's a professor of comparative nationalism at the University of Amsterdam. There's a reference to the two books that I'll be using as a basis for many of the opening opening remarks on this period later on in the slideshow. So what starts happening in the late 18th century in Ireland is a rise of antiquarianism, in that essentially amateur collectors search for artifacts, start gathering, collecting anything that is actually around, but they do it in a fairly amateurish fashion, right? So there are maps being made, there are drawings and paintings of what remained of, say, early Gothic castles or the Celtic remains, etc. Any artifacts that can be found are gathered, and also manuscripts. And manuscripts are particularly important because many of these have been preserved through the work of these antiquarians who literally just saved those books from destruction by time. A couple of pictures here. An Irish round tower, and the round towers were a particular object of interest of these antiquarians, who, as they had sort of no professional training in any discipline, started spinning all kinds of theories about these. And then the second is a manuscript page from the book that tends to be referred to in English as the Book of the Doom Cow. Second, what was very important in the construction of identity was the popularity of Ossianic poetry, which sort of extended. It actually, I mean, I should start with James Macpherson, of course, and give you some dates. Macpherson was a Scottish amateur scholar who was essentially encouraged by his colleagues at the university to go and gather what remained of folk poetry in the Scottish Highlands, which of course has the same sort of cultural roots with Ireland, in the Scottish Gaelic. And he published these first in a volume called Fragments of Ancient Poetry in 1760, and then as he was being encouraged to produce more, he essentially started plagiarizing, although the extent of the plagiarism is something that is still under debate. These translations, quote unquote, into English became instantly popular on the British Isles, and the popularity spread into continental Europe in particular. And the way the Celtic, the so-called Celts were culturally constructed very much, owes very much to the image of the Highlands and of the British Isles provided in Macpherson's poetry. So it is full of nostalgia, full of very strong emotions, and there's a lot of mist there. One thing is, I don't know if any of you studied English. Be curious if you thought about whether you learned about Macpherson at all. He tends to be omitted in most syllabi in English departments, particularly, I suppose, because of the issue of plagiarism. But at the same time, one needs to realize that Macpherson was by far the most widely read author in English for a very long period of time. And indeed, that his poetry exercised seminal influence on European pre-Romanticism and Romanticism. It influenced most of the great poets in a number of European languages. Here's an image from one of the later volumes, an epic called Fingal, discovered, quote unquote, Macpherson. There was the interest that started in the so-called Celtic poetry gave rise to a couple of seminal publications concerning the construction of the so-called Celtic identity. First, an extended essay by the French scholar Ernest Renan, La Poésie des races celtiques, published originally in 1854, focusing mostly on Brittany, but also on Ireland and Wales, to an extent on Scotland. And then Matthew Arnold's on the study of Celtic literature, which owes quite a debt to Renan's work, which was not available in English at that time. The study of Celtic literature by Arnold is essentially a transcript of lectures he gave in the 1860s at the University in Oxford, where, same as Renan, he essentially encouraged the representatives of the majority culture, English, in Renan's case French, to go and study what remains of these ancient Celtic cultures before they perish altogether, and to use them as a source to reinvigorate the literature that was being written in the majority language, in Arnold's case, in English, right? Now, their argument had quite a lot of weight, also direct consequences for scholarship, because due to Arnold's work and his lectures, the first ever chair of Celtic studies was established at the University of Oxford in 1876, the first that is in the British Isles. So this is really the very first sort of official institutional engagement by universities with so-called Celtic writing, including Irish, of course, 1876 at Oxford. Here it is, yes. To continue with what was happening in Ireland and Great Britain, and going slightly back, the amateur work of the antiquarian collectors, of whom, for instance, the father of Oscar Wilde was one, a very famous ophthalmologist and eye surgeon. That work was gradually superseded by more scientific approaches, specifically by archaeology and comparative linguistics. Right? What was quite remarkable and what is singled out in Hugh Blerson's work is George Petry's book on the Round Towers, where he establishes that these are not remains of any kind of pagan rituals, but rather that they actually belong to the Christian monasteries. And Petry, as much as he was a man of letters rather than a professional archaeologist only, Petry established beyond any doubt in his book that this was the case. So this is a sort of example of the new approaches. Now, comparative linguistics was absolutely crucial, of course, also in terms of the preservation of the riches of medieval Irish writing and early modern, of which there's a lot, so to say, in Ireland, as opposed to, for instance, Anglo-Saxon England, where there's a relative scarcity. Indo-European linguistics. Ireland provided ideal material for those linguists who were developing the theory of the common origin of so-called Indo-European languages, because the old Irish, the medieval form of the language, essentially provided them with extensive material that filled quite a few gaps in their theories. Right? First, however, they had to establish that where Old Irish actually fitted in as a language. So as a result of the sort of first examinations of extensive text, a seminal book called Grammatica Celtica was published by the German linguist Kaspar Zeuss in 1854. And this classified Old Irish as a so-called Celtic language, and indubitably one that was Indo-European, and really spurned further interest in the language because there's just so much material available to elaborate on. And in this way, Irish writing actually became the focal point of quite a number of continental linguists, not just German, but also Dutch and Danish and French, of course, who often traveled to Ireland to work with the manuscripts, and to whom we owe the publication of quite a number of those texts. Often these were published also with translations, English or French or German, as much as those translations are not particularly good if what you're looking for is poetry, because the linguists were interested in grammar, in vocabulary, things like that, rather than in, say, metaphors. So often you find figures of speech translated literally in these philological translations, which gives the reading a touch of unwanted comedy. But in any case, they did manage to circulate quite a few of these texts around, also through two principal periodicals, both of which still exist, although the first one has been renamed recently. The Revue Celtique, established in France in 1870, and the German journal Zeitschrift für keltische Philologie, established in 1897 by Kuno Meyer. So that is a bit about linguistics, and here's the reference to Lerson's fantastic work. The first book, Mere Irish, Mere Gael, actually stretches starts with the Middle Ages and goes into the 19th century, and it's the 18th century that's particularly well covered. There was a second edition in I think 1996 of the book, and Remembrance and Imagination is dedicated mostly to the 19th century. Next step is the Irish literary revival. What happens in Ireland in terms of culture, in terms of establishing an emancipated cultural identity for Ireland. There was a principal question, which was this: what to revive, right? Because Ireland, of course, was it's unique in the way that certainly by the late 19th century, there are two languages spoken on the island, mostly English, but also quite a lot of Irish still. And there was writing in both languages, because with the arrival of if you wish, the English conquerors, with the beginnings of the ascendancy, there was quite a bit of writing done in the English language, right? And in the 1890s, roughly, when the Irish literary revival began, relatively late in the day, in terms of European cultures, the intellectuals, the writers, were looking back and had to make a number of vital decisions. And that was, okay, if we want to create or revive or create a new emancipated Irish literary culture, written culture, what language should it be in? As I've indicated at the beginning of this talk, the old Gaelic literature, the old Gaelic culture essentially went into quite a rapid decline already in the 17th century. And because of the dispossession of most of the native population, because of the penal laws which barred most of the Irish population from, in effect, from education, it meant that by the 1890s, while there were still quite a few Irish speakers, there were very few of those who were actually educated in a sense. There were very few of those who actually were able to or interested in say, reading books or seeing plays in theaters, etc. And most of the writing that was there in the Irish language, as much as this, particularly in terms of poetry, would have been one of the richest European literatures of the Middle Ages and early modernity, most of the forms and most of the themes were not particularly relevant to the 1890s anymore. When you thought about writing in English, the problem was that nobody really knew, there was no existing survey as to what exactly has been actually written from Ireland, which might sound surprising, certainly to a contemporary scholar or even a student. So while most of the revivalists, even Irish language enthusiasts, acknowledge that, at least for the time being, the new writing will have to be in the English language, they did not really have any kind of systematic picture of what was there. So there were a number of early anthologies published in this period that were mapping the terrain. The first of these was this, the Cabinet of Irish Literature, an absolutely remarkable anthology edited by Charles Reid and T.P. O'Connor. First edition came out in 1879 to 80, and the revised one by Catherine Tynan in 1903 in 4 volumes, and that was a significantly extended version of that. It's an amazing resource where the editors essentially went out and gathered anything they could lay their hands on, which they regarded of any quality, and put it together into the one resource. Now, all of these texts are in English. Same as with this particular volume, which was called Irish Literature, under the general editorship of Justin McCarthy. I'm really sorry about the resolution of this image. I couldn't find anything better online. It's just a title page from volume 5 out of the 10 volumes published in 1904, mostly for the American market. And this anthology, 9 volumes of this anthology were dedicated to writing in English. And the last volume was a bilingual one with face-to-face translations from the Irish language, edited by Douglas Hyde, who was a principal revivalist. He was the first president of the Gaelic League, and indeed became the first president of the Irish Republic in its old age. There was a third resource slightly earlier than this, and that was D.J. O'Donoghue's Poets of Ireland, published in 1892. Again, apologies for the resolution of this image. An incredible work of an amateur scholar who's a librarian, who essentially spent years compiling information about any poets that he could lay his hands on in Ireland, and producing what is in effect the first dictionary of the Irish literature that have focused on poetry. Excuse me. I'll move a little bit to research, or if you wish, study of Irish literature in Ireland after independence. We continue at an earlier point. After independence, in particular, there was quite a rise in the official study of the Irish language at universities. What was rather unfortunate, as much as this was understandable for political reasons or on political grounds, writing in the Irish language was studied outside any kind of context or outside any kind of juxtaposition with what was written in the English language in Ireland. Mostly Irish writing was studied at departments of Irish, which, because of the relatively large difference between modern Irish and Old Irish in particular, was often split into departments of Old Irish or departments of Celtic Studies on the one hand, and modern Irish on the other. What they had in common was that they paid much attention to language, also to the actual teaching of the Irish language, because the revival of the language was still very much going on, and there was a relative scarcity of students who'd be actually able to read in Irish proficiently when they were entering universities. So there was much attention paid to the language and much less to things like, say, comparative contexts, right? So Irish writing, or writing in Irish, was studied in what you could call a rather isolationist manner. On the other hand, the writing of Irish writers in English was studied as well, but in departments of English, mostly under the rubric of Anglo-Irish literature with a hyphen. Now that's a term that's undergone quite a development. Certainly in the 1920s, Anglo-Irish literature as a term was applied to any writing in English that came from Ireland, right? If you fast forward to the sort of more recent years, Anglo-Irish literature is a term that tends to be applied now only to the writing of the so-called ascendancy writers, right? Essentially pre-independence writers, or those who started writing before Irish independence and wrote in the English language, starting with the beginnings of what was quite a remarkable line of English language dramatists, the likes of George Farquhar, Oliver Goldsmith, Richard Brinsley Sheridan, etc. And going through the prose writings of Gothic writers like, say, Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu or Bram Stoker, etc., looking at modern dramatists like Bernard Shaw or Oscar Wilde, and including also the writers of the revival, the likes of W.B. Yeats and Lady Gregory and John Millington Synge, because all three of them were actually of ascendancy origins. If that term is used at all these days, Anglo-Irish literature, it would be applied just to those writers. Anything that came after independence would be labeled Irish literature simply, or Irish literature in English, if the distinction is needed. I'll come back to this in a moment. After I've said a few words about continental Europe and the origins of the interest in Ireland in continental Europe. And I apologize for this focus, because that really is where my background is, so I can speak best about Europe. I wouldn't know that much about the developments in North America, for instance, or indeed elsewhere. In any case, the early interest in Ireland dates back to the early 19th century, and the reasons would be the same as the interest in Irish culture on the British Isles, certainly the first two, which is the popularity of Ossianic poetry. As I said, Ossian, so-called, the assumed author of what James Macpherson edited, was amongst the most popular poets of the entire century. The development of comparative linguistics, so there are actually quite a number of people who went to Ireland and started engaging with Ireland because of the language. And then, very importantly, the beginnings of tourism. I'll just say a few words about this, and any of my Japanese colleagues who attended one of the lectures that I gave in Tokyo, I discussed this at length in relation to Germany and the Czech lands. But what was quite interesting was that because with the beginnings of tourism in Europe, there are quite a few people who just traveled to Ireland out of interest. But there are actually quite a number of tourists whose motivations were sort of, I suppose, more complex or more significant than just seeing another country. Particularly in or around the revolutionary years 1848 and 49, there are quite a number of travelers from continental Europe who came to Ireland to examine the work of Daniel O'Connell, indeed to meet him as well as the architect of the Catholic emancipation and the leader of the repeal movement, which strove to abolish the union with Britain. And these travelers were essentially looking for models to emulate in their struggle against authoritative government in Europe. And they were not necessarily just members of, I suppose, minor cultures, those that were living under the government of a powerful neighbor, for instance, or if you wish, in a colonial situation or a situation of oppression. But also there are quite a few Germans who were interested in O'Connell's work because of their efforts to remove authoritarian regimes from the dispersed German states. And this was associated also with the efforts to unify Germany at that time. So this is the beginnings of the early interest in Ireland and continental Europe. In terms of scholarship and research, this is again associated very much with comparative linguistics. The first chair of Celtic Studies was established at the Collège de France in 1882 and was relatively quickly followed by the establishment of chairs of professorships at a number of universities in Germany and elsewhere. So this was really the beginnings of Celtic Studies, and this was the beginnings of studying Irish culture through writing in the Irish language. What was happening around the same time, the same period, was the foundation of English studies, for lack of a better term, or so-called English philology, or to use the German term anglistic, right? As a special discipline to be introduced to the two universities. The first chairs and thereby departments were set up in Europe in the 1850s and 1870s. In the first chairs were established in Zurich, in Strasbourg, in Vienna, Christiania, which is now Oslo, and Berlin. And quite a number of other institutions followed, including my own, Charles University, where English studies was established in the 1880s and officially inaugurated at the very beginning of the 20th century. And this is where quite a number of Irish writers would be studied. The notion of English philology, of course, combined, or the model was the traditional one, combining the study of the language together with the study of the literature. So the English language was taught and studied in a linguistic sense in these departments alongside the writing in the English language. And the curricula would have included quite a few Irish writers, but those Irish writers were essentially covered under the rubric of English literature rather than Irish. So the cultural context was essentially gone. While in Celtic Studies, it was only the Irish language writing and the Irish language that were studied, again, with very little communication between the two disciplines. What is of some importance too is the interest in the Irish revival. in the 1890s and the first decades of the 20th century, in particular on the part of intellectuals from countries or regions that were under foreign dominance. And there's quite a bit of documentation about contacts between intellectuals and writers in areas like the Czech lands or Poland, Galicia, the Basque country, or Catalonia, and their Irish counterparts, where again they're essentially looking for models, and the traffic is sort of mutual between the areas, one trying to emulate the other as regards forging and emancipated national culture, as regards political strategies, as regards the shapes and sizes of cultural nationalism in those areas. In more recent days, the reasons for interest in Ireland of this kind would obtain in, say, areas inhabited by the Hungarian minority in Romania, which was under the communist regime notoriously persecuted by Ceausescu and his government, deprived forcefully of their language and their culture being suppressed. So there was quite an interest in Irish culture and Irish writing, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, where post-colonial approaches were prevalent on the part of the scholars examining the Irish cultural situations from that particular perspective. My next point, or really the second part of this talk, focuses, as I promised, on Irish studies and centers and associations. And hereby I'm really making a leap from what I have been describing so far, and that is the study of Irish literature, that is the study of Irish culture, that is the study of the Irish language, to a special rubric, Irish studies. Now, that this is a long list, and I'll just run you through it. It extends over several slides, so please bear with me. And I'm sure that a number of members of the audience will be familiar with these, but perhaps this sort of systematic timeline might be of interest. The first time, as far as I'm aware, that the concept of Irish studies was reflected in the name of an association or a center was with ASIS, with the American Conference for Irish Studies, that was set up in 1960 with the purpose to connect a variety of institutions and individual scholars sort of dispersed around the United States of America to get into contact and collaborate. Now, of course, Irish studies in America has very much to do with the Irish diaspora. So if you look at areas like, say, Continental Europe, Irish studies would be mostly defined by a focus on literature or on history, possibly also on politics and sociology, while in places with a large Irish diaspora like the United States, the focus will be much broader. There will be quite a bit of focus on folk culture, on dance, music, and there will be also a lot of what these days is referred to as outreach activities, meaning things that are actually done with and for the public, right? As much as ASIS is, of course, principally an academic scholarly association rather than one which would serve as a cultural center. The very first Institute of Irish Studies was interestingly established at Queen's University, Belfast. And why interestingly? Because it was set up founded by a Welsh geographer, or if you wish, cultural geographer, Estyn Evans, who some of you might be familiar with through his amazing publications on Irish folk culture. The most famous book, I believe, being called The Irish Folk Ways, which is of interest even to someone like me, a drama scholar, where you have things like drawings of farming implements, including the loy with which Christy Mahan in J.M. Singh, The Plague of the Western World, would have killed his father. So it is of quite some interest across the range of disciplines. Now, on a more serious note, this institute was set up also, although not overtly, but the setting up of Irish Studies at Queen's was a political gesture at a point where the troubles were about to start, where essentially someone who was not a local set up a center whose remit was to look at Irish culture in its entirety unified, right? Rather than focusing on, say, things in the Irish language only or in the English language only, rather than focusing on the Catholic community or the Protestant community only in Northern Ireland. So politically, this was of a huge significance, Institute of Irish Studies. And the institute still exists, although it's been sort of recently subsumed under a larger school. What they do mostly has to do with sociology, geography, and politics, and history, while they also have a literary dimension. In 1973, the Canadian Association for Irish Studies was set up as separate from IASIS. Of the many institutions, or relatively many, I should say, in the US that actually have an Irish Studies program, a prominent one was opened in 1978 at Boston College, which is really one of the sort of global strongholds of research in Irish culture. And in 1981, SOFAIR, the French National Association of Irish Studies, was set up. And again, SOFAIR is, in terms of the sort of recent map, is quite successful in uniting scholars working in different disciplines, because it features, its members are part literary scholars and part historians, but there are also quite a few people who work in areas like conflict resolution, in the study of nationalism, in sociology, etc. And all of those were joined under this network set up in France in 1981. Shortly after, the British Association base was founded in the United Kingdom in 1985, and BASE is a strong and vibrant association, as is SOFAIR, while its remit is to a large extent influenced by the presence of the very large Irish diaspora in the UK, which means that BASE, quite apart from the academic activities and conferences, BASE members host and organize quite a few things or events for the public. And generally, certainly during the years of the Troubles, one of the principal remits that BASE members felt was theirs was to spread accurate information about the Irish, particularly in England, where there was a lot of hostility against the Irish due to the IRA bombing campaigns. So that's BASE. Two significant dates for Irish history and its sort of official status, 1988 and 1991, where first in 1988, the Institute of Irish Studies was inaugurated at the University of Liverpool, which was mostly the work of Marianne Elliott, who was a colleague of Roy Foster, R.F. Foster, who was appointed the Carroll Chair of Irish History at the University of Oxford, at Hertford College. And these were really the first institutions in the United Kingdom that had a strong official focus on Irish history. This was not something that obtained before that. It was largely due to the campaigning and the efforts of these two, at that time, very young historians. Now, both the Institute at Liverpool and the Chair of Irish History at Oxford, I'm glad to say, still exist and are thriving. The current incumbent, after Roy Foster retired, is Ian McBride, who took the chair in 2016, and the chair was actually renamed in honor of Roy Foster to the Foster Chair of Irish History. In 1989, so in the same period, the Brazilian Irish Studies Association, ABE, was established and also shortly after inaugurated its journal. And again, the situation in Brazil is specific in that they have been working with the local Irish diaspora and looked at examining the vibrant contacts between Ireland and Brazil, not just in literature, but on a much broader scale. Also, there's recently quite a lot of focus on Roger Casement, of course, who came to Brazil and was a very important figure in terms of Brazilian culture and politics too. 1993 sees the establishment of another hub for Irish studies at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, the Keogh Milton Institute for Irish Studies, which has same as Boston College, has amazing resources. And as late as in the year 2000, when the first Centre for Irish Studies was established in Ireland at National University of Ireland, Galway, where still, although the historical reasons for this are quite clear, as are the political ones, but still to many an outsider, this might look like a slightly paradoxical situation that you are looking at a country where, for instance, you cannot study the literature of the country in its entirety in a single institution, or under the one department or as the one subject, right? Which certainly in most nation states is quite the norm. I mean, if you study German at the German university, you will study all of German literature. But in Ireland, if you wanted to study the writing both in Irish and in English, you really have to enroll in two subjects. The Centre for Irish Studies at Galway is a relatively small unit, but it has brought in to the existing very strong Irish and English departments at Galway, and has brought a focus on music, dance, and performance in particular, alongside language and literature. So that's NUI Galway. Principal centres in continental Europe. Our centre was really one of the first, which is something that really happened mostly because we were at the right place at the right time, so to speak. That after 1989, with the collapse of the Iron Curtain, what happened was that there was this period of virtually complete relaxation of regulations over university curricula, which particularly in the humanities would have been very strongly influenced by the totalitarian ideology. So after 89, to put it bluntly, scholars and academics and students could do what they wanted. So we were really fortunate in that essentially anything that was new and of interest to students could be promoted at our department and could be taught. So that's how I started already as a master's student, teaching the first seminars in the mid-1990s. And again, as luck would have it, there are two of my Irish colleagues who came to Prague around the same time and started teaching the first courses in Irish literature. We also had briefly an Irish language lecturer. And eventually, as we persevered, and with the significant help of the Irish government, which needs to be acknowledged here with enormous gratitude, he gave us a little bit of money on a long-term basis. There was not that much, but it was continuous and consistent, and it allowed us to, for instance, build a library, as in a library collection rather than the building, so that we had text to teach from, and we were able to welcome guest speakers from Ireland and elsewhere. We were able to attend conferences, etc. And over the years, we've essentially built it into a centre that was officially inaugurated in 2001. There are very strong centres of Irish studies in Aarhus, in Denmark, and in Dalarna in Sweden. There's an amazing institute in A Coruña, in Galicia. There is a vibrant Irish Studies Centre in Leuven. There's one in Granada. Recently, there was a collaborative centre established by our colleagues in Budapest, joining individuals from several universities into this sort of virtual unit. And the same thing happened recently in Spain, where scholars from, I believe, 3 or 4 universities formed a centre called BAN, or Bond. Above that, there are quite a number of smaller units operating mostly in English departments or in departments of history across Europe, and then scattered individuals and enthusiasts. The Spanish Association of Irish Studies, another vibrant one, IAD, was established in 2001, and most recently, the line of national associations, the Polish Association of Irish Studies was formed, and some of its members are hopefully going to host the IASIL conference in Łódź this summer, which is an event that was supposed to happen already last year, but had to be cancelled due to COVID. And finally, international associations. Now, I mentioned the fact that there are quite a number of scholars, enthusiasts who focus on Irish culture, who are scattered around and often don't have much of an institutional support. And of course, this is not a uniquely European thing, but rather a problem that our colleagues have been facing all across the world. So, and this has been a problem for decades. In response to this, the first international association was set up in 1969, hosting its first conference holding its first conference in 1970, and that was IASIL, at that time called IASIL, which stands for the International Association for the Study of Anglo-Irish Literature. What they meant by Anglo-Irish at that time was the study of literature in the English language, rather than just focusing on the ascendancy writers. Okay. The association changed its name in the late 1990s in recognition for the need to actually engage with the culture of Ireland, or the writing of Ireland in its entirety, meaning both languages, as much as most of the discussions are about writers in English language still. In 1984, IASIL Japan, or IASIL Japan, was formed as a branch of the large IASIL, joining together the high number of scholars who were scattered around Japan and who very often did not have a chance to meet otherwise. And this has been one of the most vibrant associations of Irish literary studies and Irish studies over the years. In 1998, EFASIS was initiated, which is the European network of Irish studies, federations, associations, or rather associations and centers of Irish studies, initiated from France, but in recognition for greater contact between the French scholars and others. But by now, it's, or within a few years, I should say, it's really become an all-European association. In 2001, the Scandinavian network, NISN, Nordic Irish Studies Network, was formed. There was another association of Irish studies set up in 2003 in Brazil, the Irish Latin American Studies Association, SILAS. In 2006, scholars who work from Australia and New Zealand formed an Irish Studies Association, the ISANS. In 2018, yet another Latin American or South American association was formed, the IASIL, which joins scholars who work sort of south of Brazil, so to speak, in the southern part of South America. And most recently, there's a new network that was inaugurated mostly by historians, the Global Irish Diaspora Congress, which had its inaugural conference in 2019. Having said, or having shown you this slide about international associations, I need to emphasize that the national associations mentioned in the previous slide also very much welcome international participants, so they're not sort of like the Spanish is not open just to Spanish scholars or Spain-based scholars. Everybody is really keen on collaborations across any borders. Another important thing, the establishment of journals, because one of the difficulties that was recognized when IASIL was being established in particular was the scarcity of publication venues. And this was something that was really recognized and replicated by most of the other associations that I mentioned. So here are some of the principal journals, publication venues. The oldest of these being the IUR, the Irish University Review, that was set up by members of IASIL in 1970. In 1976, Institut Irlandais was set up. In this case, this actually predates by 5 years the establishment of the French Association of Irish Studies, SOFAIR. So that the journal was there first, right? The Journal of Irish Studies, or what was originally called the HARP, was established in Japan in 1985, now called the Journal of Irish Studies. BASE inaugurated its journal in 1992, the Irish Studies Review, and that's a very, very important periodical. NISN has its own journal, the Nordic Irish Studies Journal, which started in 2002. There's a Spanish journal, Estudios Irlandeses, set up by ID in 2005. There is and Estudios Irlandeses is an online journal, same as Studi Irlandesi, which is an Italian-based journal set up from the University of Florence by Fiorenzo Fantaccini, a local scholar and enthusiast for things Irish. And most recently, in 2016, the Review of Irish Studies in Europe, another online journal abbreviated as RCIS, was set up by Ephesus, which also runs its own book series or series of critical monographs. Three final slides, but the last one is picture. Critical approaches. Just a very quick summary, because I promised to say a little bit about perspectives. These will pertain mostly to literature, which is my area of expertise, but I suppose will apply to some other areas of culture as well. If you want a survey of literary studies and the approaches that have obtained over the 20th century mostly, I'd recommend the essay by Cohen Graham in the second volume of the Cambridge History of Irish Literature, edited by Margaret Keller and Philip O'Leary. What has defined Irish literary scholarship in particular throughout much of the 20th century was, to borrow a term from Paul Deman, resistance to theory, right? So no theoretical approaches to speak of would have been really prevalent or just even used by most scholars focusing on Irish literature well into the 1990s, one could argue. Literature and culture would have been throughout much of the 20th century would have been discussed predominantly as a reflection of the nation, would have been viewed through concepts like Irishness, national identity, and also rather ephemeral varieties of the same, like the Irish spirit or the Irish mode, or even a curious concept, the Irish mind, which I never could get my head around. How does an Irish mind operate against, as opposed to, I don't know, English mind or a Hungarian mind or whatever. So, but these were sadly concepts that were used by serious scholars for quite some time. At the same time, major writers like Joyce, Yeats, Wilde, and Beckett in particular would have been studied also under the influence of Richard Ellman's notion of individual genius. So there would be a focus solely on their work, right? As a sort of emanation of the one creative mind, while Joyce and Beckett in particular would have been studied internationally in other contexts as well, like, for instance, modernism or world literature, or indeed within Beckett's case. It was only in the 1980s that post-colonial approaches arrived, mostly through the work of scholars associated with Field Day, the publishers of the Field Day anthology. And it was only from the 1990s that feminist approaches and gender studies became more prominent, pointing out the inequality of gender that obtained across Irish culture, including the cultural outputs, pointing out things like the deficiencies of the Field Day anthology, which, with its pluralistic intentions, managed to omit most women writers, etc. And recently, there has been, of course, quite a bit of focus on so-called New Irish, because due to the effects of the Celtic Tiger, the boom of the Irish economy, Ireland, you could say, became multicultural more or less overnight, certainly in relation to other areas, and suddenly is a sort of ethnically and culturally diverse society. The relevance of Irish studies. What has Irish studies to offer to the contemporary world is a question that many of us tend to be asked, also by funders. So if you ever are asked, I can give you a few suggestions. This would certainly be my response. First and foremost, I would say this, that Irish culture is amazingly rich, and it is worth studying for its own sake, full stop. It is just an amazingly rich culture. There is some exceptional writing from Irish writers, which just broadens people's horizons, introduces new words, new concepts, etc., new experiences. But that's probably not something that you can sell to funders much, although I think it is an idea that needs to be defended, and it needs to be defended vigorously in relation to, I suppose, any culture worth studying. What I would argue alongside this is that Ireland indeed offers a wealth of material for comparative studies of, say, colonialism, identity formation, nationalism, also, of course, sadly, in relation to Northern Ireland, and the resurgence of fairly toxic forms of nationalism around the Brexit negotiations, for instance, etc. There is much to study concerning migration, and that does not mean just the centuries of the history of Irish emigration, meaning Irish immigrants, but also the more recent period with, as I said, Ireland becoming ethnically diverse and multicultural, and the treatment of the migrants and their position in contemporary Irish society. In other areas, amazing material for comparative studies of literary modernism, for instance, development of modern and contemporary Irish or contemporary theatre, where Irish theatre is a really interesting case study where what used to be a fairly homogeneous, stylistically speaking, scene is now really thriving, going in all kinds of different directions. The study of Ireland has much to say to in comparison with studies of other traditional musics and how music has spread from Ireland and to Ireland, in folk music or dance, indeed. The Irish economy in the recent years has provided an interesting material for economists examining the rocket-like boom of the economy in the late 1990s and its super fast collapse, and then the way the country has managed to cope with the collapse of its economy reasonably well. And last but not least, globalization and its effects is another area where a relative, I suppose, a pre-modern culture, you could argue, certainly in the early 1920s, comes into increasing contact with other industrialized cultures, and what happens as a result of that, what happens in the contemporary period with the extent of global travel, Ireland being a popular tourist destination, etc. Finally, international perspectives from regions without an Irish diaspora, meaning not necessarily from the US or from the UK or certain areas of Brazil, I think have much to say or much to add to the sort of canonical perspectives in terms of offering alternative views of how Irish culture is defined and perceived, or Irish literature, or Irish identity. If you do a case study of theatre, there's a canonical notion of what Irish theatre and Irish drama is about, but that notion comes largely from the Anglosphere, from places with an Irish diaspora, and is remarkably different from even continental Europe, never mind other areas that are culturally more distant. I shall leave you with this picture, final slide in this talk. I really like this, I have to say. Not only I love Louis Le Brocque's work, but this is a tapestry, or a design for a tapestry, the so-called Brendan tapestry from the 1960s, from which IASIL has taken its logo. The logo is this arc here, right? And I like this image, particularly in the context of Irish studies and this lecture, in that it shows Irish studies as part of a bigger picture, really. It also emphasizes what I've always found as being particularly remarkable, and that's the extent of collegiality and collaboration, friendship among Irish studies scholars globally, which is not something that is true of other areas of research. So it is a very welcoming, friendly, and collaborative effort by and large. And last but not least, as it's a ship, we're on the same boat. And I would like to welcome the new BUE Research Centre on this boat and sail with us. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention.
Well, Ondrej, thank you for guiding us in such a grand tour, about Irish studies or, Celtic studies. And well, there are several questions in the chat section. And can you see these questions?
Yes, I can. I've just opened it. So should I take it from the beginning? Yeah. Okay. First question from Osama Madani. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Why the delay in
Osama Madani? Yes, Professor Osama Madani is the Dean of MENA University here in Cairo. So we're very honored to have him with us this evening.
I'm delighted and honored. So Professor Madani is asking, why the delay in establishing an Irish Studies Centre proper in Ireland until 2000? Is there political reasons for that? What I was trying to indicate, and yes, admittedly, I have been focusing mostly on literature because that's where I'm at home in a professional sense, right? But historically, things have developed with the study of Irish culture in such a way that things in the Irish language would have been studied separately from those in the English language, while if you look at what has been written in the English language, this in Ireland would have been studied in departments of English, same as anywhere else in, say, Europe, right? Although, of course, in Ireland, they would hardly call someone like, say, Bernard Shaw or Oscar Wilde or James Joyce an English writer, which is what too often has happened elsewhere. But they were essentially, these areas were very strong and were set up under different disciplines. And then you had, other areas like Irish music, for instance, which would naturally be studied in departments of music. So I suppose there was, it had to do with the way disciplines were set up at universities and the fact that there was little need, I suppose, that was felt, certainly on the part of management, to create something that would join these together. But at the same time, I should also note something which has to do with the, until very recently, quite extensive non-communication between scholars who have engaged with the Irish language material versus the English language, right? And that is the fact that Irish language scholars would have been fairly protective of their area and material for a couple of reasons. One, political, I suppose, where quite a number of the, certainly in the early days of the Irish language scholars would have believed in United Ireland, so we're not happy with, for instance, the compromise, so yes, political reasons. But more recently, it has to do with the fact that English is a global language, and and this is what many Irish language authors feel too, that once their work is actually translated into English, even people in Ireland will not bother reading it in the original anymore. They will just read it in the English translation because it's more accessible to them. So that's, I suppose, another reason. I hope that answers the question. Is the Irish revival accomplished, or is it on the road to revival? A question from Hiroyoshi Camillo. That's a complicated one. Also politically, depends on what you mean by the Irish revival. If what is meant by the Irish revival is the effort to establish an emancipated sovereign culture, yes, the Irish revival has been very much accomplished, regardless of the language. There is a vibrant literature in English and in Irish, and recognized globally as the product of Ireland as opposed to Britain. So that would be my answer. Next question from John McGowan. Was there a point that the Irish language could have been rescued as the national language if it had been studied in a less isolationist way? Did comparative linguistics make it too academic niche? The problem with the Irish language as the first language of the island is very simply that due to the political situation in the 19th century in particular, and specifically due to the Great Famine in the late 1840s, Irish language speakers started abandoning the language for reasons of survival, simply. This is something that a sociolinguist, Reg Hindley, has referred to as linguistic suicide. What happened in the 1850s and 1860s in Ireland in particular, in that Irish families who would have up until then in rural areas raised their children through the Irish language, essentially decided at that one point to start raising their children through the English language, because they knew that literally if the children wanted to survive, they needed to speak English, because they would have to leave the country and go to mostly America or England to look for jobs and for food, right? So by the 1890s, when the language revival started, the language was at such a state that it has been argued that no language revival has been successful, in the sense of bringing back the language as the first language of the people, apart from Hebrew in Israel, which is a very different context, right? So in a sense, it was doomed, but at the same time, the Irish language is still spoken by some thousands of people. It is taught at universities. It is a language of literature. It is fortunately not likely to disappear, but it is going to remain a minority language. While all the speakers these days of the Irish language, even those who prefer to speak Irish on all occasions, are actually bilingual. They speak English too. Right, you mentioned Amal Mazhar is asking, you mentioned that the major writers who were studied were Joyce, Yeats, Wilde, and Beckett. What about Bernard Shaw? Yes, absolutely. But when I mentioned Richard Ellman and that concept of individual genius, this came from his work on James Joyce and Yeats and eventually Wilde. So that's why I singled out those writers, because that was his approach. He was an American scholar who was the author of what is still the standard biography of James Joyce. He wrote two hugely influential books on W.B. Yeats, and his final major work was a biography of Oscar Wilde. And you treat these writers essentially in isolation, if you wish, while of course being very much aware of the cultural context, etc., but focusing essentially on the work of that single writer. He never wrote about Shaw, so that sort of explains the context.
I would just like to say that Professor Amal Mazhar is an esteemed professor from Cairo University, and we're very honored to have her with us this evening. Professor Amal Mazhar was also one of the professors on my PhD panel.
All right.
2004. So I'm very honored that she's also with us this evening. So thank you for having made the time to join us and to pose that question.
Wonderful. Many thanks from me too. And indeed, Mari Masood is our cherished colleague in IASIL. She's been coming to conferences regardless of her age and physical condition. She has been a real stalwart. And of course, she was the organizer of the IASIL conference in Cairo some decades ago.
I think we've also with us today Professor Aida Jean from Ain Shams University, same university as Professor Mary Masoud. Also Professor Aida Jean taught me when I was at university at Ain Shams, so she's also with us this evening.
Wonderful, thank you. I don't know if there are any other questions. I know somebody was raising a hand while I was going through the question in the chat. So.
Well, Ondrej, if you'll allow me to ask a question.
Sure.
And it's not related to the lecture directly, but it's more or less to the second part of it, which is the establishment of the Centers for Irish Studies that's happening globally. Now that we've established a research center for Irish Studies here in Cairo, and it is the only one of its kind in Egypt, on the African continent, and in the Middle East. From your international perspective as IASIL chairperson or director, well, I mean, of course, you've been very welcoming, very supportive, but what does that mean to the international community?
Well, if you ask me, and I'm sure that most of my colleagues will reciprocate, we are thrilled. It is amazing to see developments like this, because these are precarious times in terms of academia and the humanities, as we all know, and the situation is not likely to get better with the COVID pandemic and its impact, which we are still to see. We can, I suppose, be reasonably sure that there'll be again cuts in the humanities in a number of institutions globally, and setting up Irish Studies as a research center, which is, frankly speaking, focused on a small culture, is not easy anywhere, right? We're really one thing I should have probably emphasized even more strongly is the importance of these networks that we're all members in, because they are essential. Because when something like IASIL was set up, at that time the principal problem was that there were all these people engaged in the study and the teaching of Irish literature, and they could not communicate. So it was about physically bringing people together and sharing their research. These days, while this, of course, is absolutely vital still, we also need to think about plotting grant projects together, research projects together, to share information about funding sources, etc. This is getting increasingly vital. We also have to increasingly take care of our graduate students and early career scholars, where, of course, there's a drastic shortage of jobs on the market for any specialists in Irish culture. And we need to help them from the position of senior scholars to, get their bearings on the markets and try to help them, so to speak, sell their skills so that they can continue working in the area which they have studied in. So yes, we are absolutely amazed that despite everything, suddenly we have new colleagues and a new center.
We have also Professor, and I will leave the floor to Professor Hiroko in a minute, but we also have Professor Aida Jean Rageb. If you're able to just say a few words about your affiliate, your membership in IASIL, if you're able to open up your speaker, Professor Aida. I know Professor Aida is with us. She just sent me a text message. So, Professor Aida, are you with us? Are you able to open your speaker, or have I muted you? Well, okay. Well, Professor Aida has just sent us a message saying that she was Professor Aida Jean Rageb is a professor at Ain Shams University in the English department, Faculty of Arts, and she was a member in IASIL in the late 80s, and she read a paper in Surrey, Northern Ireland. or was it? It's Coleraine.
Coleraine, yeah, it's Coleraine. Yeah.
Okay, yes. So thank you, Professor Ida, for sharing this information with us. We hope you will be a member of BIASIL again soon, and we're happy to, to support you in any way that is necessary. Professor Hiroko, the floor is back to you now.
Okay, so it's time to close the session, isn't it?
If you'd like to wrap up with the main points, and then after that, I will have a minute just to say thank you to everyone.
Yeah, well, it's really great occasion. And well, at the very end of the lecture, it's really encouraging us. Us means, somebody who are not Irish or somebody who are not Irish diaspora, but, really interested in Irish studies or Irish literature. And the Irish studies is now widening up. And in that sense, this field of study is welcoming us. And I think this is really great opportunity for us for the future collaboration, Rania, and well, think more about it. So, any more questions about the lecture? Okay, so Ondrej, on behalf of everybody here today, thank you for inspiring us on a very important topic related to Irish studies. And I also like to thank the audience for participation. And now I'll leave the rest to Rania.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I would like to wrap up the research seminar for today, organized and hosted by the BUE Research Centre for Irish Studies. To thank, on behalf of also the BUE, Professor Ondrej Pilny, for agreeing to give us this very valuable time and the knowledge that you've shared this evening. With regards to Irish studies, putting everyone on, the first step, those interested in it. I mean, I think that was really important. And giving us a global perspective of all the research centers and the associations around the world. Professor Hiroko Mikami, I cannot thank you enough, and our colleagues from Japan for making the time to attend today's research seminar. I'm sure it's past midnight now, you're all exhausted, but it is the weekend, so it's okay for you to sleep in tomorrow morning. I would also like to thank the esteemed professors from universities here in Egypt, Professor Osama Medini, Professor Aida Jinrare, Professor Amal Mazhar. We also have Dr. Emenia Diasti, also Dr. Mary Michael, Dr. Mary Gonzalez Chacon from Spain, Dr. Sarah Medini, and everyone who's made the time to attend our very first research seminar. I'm Dr. Rania M Rafik Khali. I'm the acting director for the Research Centre for Irish Studies. On behalf of everyone, thank you very much and have a pleasant weekend.
And thank you very much for your attention, and Rania for hosting this seminar, indeed the seminar series. I'm delighted that other colleagues have joined me in this series, and Hiroko, again, thank you so much for staying up, and indeed all your Japanese colleagues, and Hiroko for introducing me. Much pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.